This is not how you start a video. Where the heck did Got it. Hey guys, Will here, and I don't know if you can tell or not just by my voice, but I am still very much fighting off the last vestiges of bronchitis. My head is just stuffy, it's hard to breathe, so probably won't be putting out another exercise video for just a little bit longer till all this crud finally leaves my chest. But I wanted to do something, and I wanted to do something fun, so that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk about swords, because I like swords. I love swords. I am not alone in my fascination with medieval weaponry. In fact, I say medieval weaponry, but swords were used, you know, as recently in a military sense. You know, they still carry sabers and whatnot for like dress purposes and parades and all that. But I mean, cavalry sabers were in use all the way up to, I want to say, World War II. In fact, one crazy guy, and I know you've probably seen the story on the internet, and if I can find it, I'll post a link to it. But one guy, I'm pretty sure, carried like a bow and arrow and a broadsword, like storming the beaches in World War II. I don't know, I can't remember like the full story on that, but I know I've seen a picture, and there he is running on a beach somewhere with a broadsword. so yeah. I love swords, and today we're going to talk about what is and isn't a sword, what makes a sword quote-unquote real, and I'm going to show you my collection such that it is over the years. So first, I think let's talk about what's not a sword, because that's where I started. When I started collecting swords, I was, you know, in my early teens. Before that, you know, my brother and I would fashion swords out of anything that we could find to hit each other with. So, you know, sticks. My dad was an electrician, so we had metal conduit in the garage that I don't know how anyone thought this was a good idea, but we took a piece of metal conduit, it was about 8 foot long, we chopped it in half with a hacksaw, pounded flat a good portion of each piece of metal conduit. We pounded it flat with a sledgehammer, leaving just enough still round for a handle, taped up some cross guards, and we used to fight with those until I think I accidentally cut my brother's face with one. But so don't do that, is what I'm saying. But I've been fascinated with swords since I can remember. I think that's a pretty common thing for most people. Well, not most people, but a lot of people, especially people that might stumble upon a video talking about swords. So that's where it began, and you know, it was all very self-learning, self-taught in those early days. You know, it was, swords are made out of metal and they're sharp, they got a pointy end, and yeah, that was the extent of my knowledge. Around 15 or 16, my brother and I, we went to Actually, it was a Feast of the Hunter's Moon fair type thing. It was one of those living history things, but it was very like early settlers in America, or like 1800s, something like that. So, you know, buckskin caps and muskets and the Davy Crockett thing. But we're wandering through the shops, and lo and behold, they are selling swords in this little tent. And they're not like cavalry sabers or anything like that. They're selling what looks like medieval swords. Now, at the time, one of the big movies that was out, and I'm putting on leather gloves, by the way. Like I said, some of these are real swords, some of these are not so real swords. They're all made out of metal. The gloves have two functions here. One, some of them are sharp, some of them aren't sharp. So one thing is it's harder to cut yourself when you're wearing leather gloves, and the other thing is your hands, you as a person, create oils. And when oil gets on a real sword that we'll look at here in just a little bit, that is very bad, because a real sword is not stainless. That's one thing. But let's go ahead and dive into this, and we'll just kind of move along, and I'll start talking about stuff here. So, in this tent, there were a couple of swords. Very, you know, now that I'm older and understand what these things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to be made, these are what we would call your classic wall hanger. They're metal, right? And so that's a huge selling point for 15-year-old me. It's metal, it has a point, and somebody sharpened it. But I bought this guy. You may recognize this from one of the more historically inaccurate medieval films, very, very famous film, Braveheart. But I was absolutely in love with that movie, and I saw this guy in that tent, and I thought I have to. And oh my God, it was only $50. So I did. I don't know how I did it. I convinced my parents to let me purchase this thing. I don't know what they were thinking, but yeah, I bought this thing for $50. It had a really, you know, crappy fake leather scabbard. I don't even know that this stuff down here is real leather. It's some kind of like suede material. But this is the first sword that I bought. Now, the guy that I bought it from, he bought it from probably like Bud K magazine or one of those other Mall Ninja magazines, where a lot of times they'll use words like spring steel, right? And if you've researched swords at all, spring steel, like that might make you think something. But the way that advertising works is this is technically spring steel, but it's spring steel in that this used to be probably part of a leaf spring in a truck. And that's how they get away with doing that. They will, the leaf spring in a lot of old pickup trucks and whatnot, it's part of the rear suspension, and what it is a bunch of flat metal pieces on top of each other in a roughly like crescent shape, and all those metal bars sit on top of each other and they make a spring, and that's a shock absorber for your rear end of the truck. And so it is, by the loosest of definitions, spring steel. It is steel that was part of a spring. And what they will do is they will usually like laser cut it to shape and then just go to town with a grinder and grind it to whatever shape they want. Now this is, they went ahead and they like nickel plated this to make it stainless. or as stainless as they could. The thing about that, swords are not stainless. Swords are tempered. That means they have flex and bend. And this actually does have a little bit of flex and bend because, again, it is technically spring steel. So, you know, it passes that test. It doesn't have a lot of flex or bend to it, but you can take it and bend it, and it will return to a mostly true form. I mean, I don't know if you can see this, but looking down this blade, you can definitely see some waves and stuff. This has seen some abuse. This has seen me hitting little trees and sticks and anything else that I thought I could hit with it and not get in trouble. So you'll see the edge of the blade here. There are nicks running all through this thing. I have sharpened and resharpened this probably a dozen times. I still have it because it's a bit of nostalgia. It hangs on my wall next to a fantasy D&D map that a friend of mine drew. So yeah, I've kept this over the years. Gosh, it's been 20 years now I've had this. I've broken it. And let me show you the other thing that makes this not a real sword. For one thing, I know the guys in, what's that channel where they make fantasy weapons and stuff? Not Forged in Fire, that's a TV show, but it's the Baltimore Knife and Sword Company. They have a YouTube channel where they make really awesome weapons, and a lot of times they thread the pommel, which I personally have never seen an extant sword, meaning one like dug up in archaeology or whatever that had a threaded pommel. But that's not to say it didn't exist. It's just I've never seen one in my research. Anyway, so this pommel here was clearly like stamped out. It's got some heft to it, which is nice. It actually does balance the sword out a bit, so that's kind of cool. But then we've got this handle here, and this handle is definitely not wood. The inside of this is plastic. I don't know if you can really tell from there, but yeah, that is a plastic handle with, again, it was probably like injection molded or something to give it these little ridges here. And then they just glued and sewed some fake leather stuff on it. So that's fun. This isn't going to come off anymore because here is the tang on this. As you can see, all they did was they cut the leaf spring here, giving it this short little stubby square thing, and then they literally just tack welded along basically a screw onto the end of this, and this is very soft and bendy. While I was hitting things that I shouldn't have been hitting with this, what ended up happening naturally is you've got all that force concentrated on this little spot here, and it snapped right off. The sword just fell apart in my hands. Luckily, I had a friend who had a welder, and he was gracious enough to go ahead and just tack weld this little guy right back on there. But yeah, this is not how a sword should be constructed by any stretch of the imagination. Typically, the tang, that's what this is called, the part that goes into the handle, the tang, it would indeed, there'd be shoulders there, but it's all forged out as one piece. You know, it's not, the blade and the handle are not two separate pieces that are then put together. The blade thins and narrows into the tang, which then extends down the handle, and then typically what this little button on the end of here is supposed to represent is they would then peen, typically hot peen, the steel over the pommel, the end cap of the sword. So yeah, this is a very good indicator that you have purchased a wall hanger. This is not meant to be used in any fashion, despite the fact that I did anyway. Don't do it. Because, I mean, this could have broken catastrophically, and it is indeed a sharp piece of metal. So things could have gone very, very poorly for me while I was out being a dumb teenager and swinging this thing around. So let me just put that back together there, and we'll move on a little bit. I also actually have the sword that my brother bought when I bought this one, because he wasn't going to be left behind. If I'm going to buy a sword, well, he's going to buy a sword too. And Mom and Dad, I'm so sorry, but I think you probably know, yeah, we both totally swung these at each other. Don't do what I do. If you're watching this video, don't do that. It's very dumb. Very, very dumb. So, this was my first ever sword. If we look over here, we've got what I believe they were calling a Scottish claymore. You can actually see there's a stamp on this blade that is very hard to read now, because again, this is 20 years old, but it says Pakistan and it says stainless. This is a beefy chunk of metal that has no bend to it whatsoever, and if I were to try to bend this thing in any real fashion, it would not return to true. Because this is not a tempered blade. This is not a real sword. This is, again, something that kids buy because it's cool, and that I have for nostalgia purposes and as a bit of wall decoration. The construction of this thing, again, it's all like cast parts. Again, it's got the screw, and this guy unscrews and comes off. Excuse me. Bronchitis. It's not fun. This one does have a wooden handle that's got some cool little carvings going on there. Kind of neat. And it's, you know, it's basically somebody saw a picture of a Scottish claymore in probably like a museum or a magazine or something like that, because again, this is 20 years ago. They saw a picture of a Scottish claymore, and they just put together their approximation of it and knew that somebody would buy it. So, and somebody did. But again, just a wall hanger, pretty to look at, stupid heavy as far as like an actual sword would go. And also just, this is very much smaller than what a Scottish claymore would actually be. But again, it looked cool. So there we go. Okay, real quick diversion from trip down memory lane. This is many years later. I decided to make a wall hanger, or actually a friend of mine decided to make a wall hanger. And we took apart a bunch of wall hangers to make this guy. You might have seen this in my last scabbard video. This is just a piece of a Toledo steel, typically very fancy, like etched kind of thing. It's meant to be an art piece. What we've done with it is we've just made this amalgamation of a sword, mostly so that I could make a scabbard for it and then give it away as a gift. It's just something kind of cool to look at. So, there we go. That's the detour. Back on track. I started learning and started researching and actually reading books and whatnot about swords and what makes a sword a real sword. And I learned about how the tang is supposed to be formed. I learned about the fact that it's not stainless steel, it is mild steel because it has to be tempered. That gives it its flexibility and its ability to absorb damage and not break. So I went full tilt and started using words like full tang and high carbon spring steel without, fully understanding what all that meant. But we went to the Ohio Renaissance Festival. I think I was probably 17 or 18 at the time. And we saw a demonstration by a group at the time. I think it was called Badger Blades. And they had these swords and they were chopping cinder blocks with them, kind of demonstrating how indestructible they were and how high quality they were. Little did I know, no one would ever hit a cinder block with a real sword. Like, that's ludicrous. You're not going to do that. You are going to instantly ruin the edge of your weapon. So, but it was flashy, and it was cool, and it was what I thought at the time was a real sword. It was made with high carbon steel. It had crazy flexibility. For one of his demonstrations, he put the tip in the ground, which again, don't do that. Don't do that. But he put the tip in the ground, he put his foot in the middle of the blade, and he bent it in like a U shape. And then, boom, came right back to true, straight as an arrow. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. So I had to have one. And at this time, I'm working, my part-time job, saving up money. I think I spent $125, $150 on this. But this is what I got. This is what I got. This is what they were calling their long sword, because they were using, honest to God, they were using the D&D description of swords for each of their different pieces. Short sword, long sword, one-handed sword, bastard sword, great sword, all these other things. This guy is what I would define as a stage combat weapon. You can see the edges here are very blunt. It is effectively a thick piece of, it is high carbon steel, and it is super flexy and indestructible. It's one of the things they were beating cinder blocks with. This has seen some serious abuse since those days. But the selling point for me on this one was the fact that the tang was the full width of the blade. Now, as you can see, this blade is very, very thin. I have seen rapiers that have wider blades than this. And there's no taper. There's no fuller. It's just a stick of metal. A stick of metal in a vaguely sword shape that can be banged around and beat up, and their claim to fame at the time was that if you could find a way to break it, they would give you a new one. So yeah, that was it. It was a big draw to me at the time, because I thought, finally, a real sword. I could put an edge on this and I'd have a real sword. You could put an edge on this. The thing about it is, this metal, with swords, there's a lovely little dance where the heart of the sword is softer than the edges. The edges are typically hard. That's what you get when you construct a sword properly. And there are many videos that you can watch and see how swords are actually constructed now. YouTube is an amazing thing. But this, however, this was all forged and all tempered to be pretty much the same throughout the whole blade. The edges are no harder than the middle. The middle is no softer than the edges. It's all pretty homogeneous throughout. It's wonderful for hitting other things like this. You get the amazing clang and all that fun stuff. You can do stage combat and choreography, and you really don't have to worry about ruining your prop. That's what I would call this. This is a prop. This is a a great indestructible prop. Because of how thick the blade is this way and how it's not really made to be an actual sword, this handles like crap when compared to an actual sword. It's actually quite heavy compared to an actual sword. But again, 17, 18 at the time, this was the coolest thing ever. And yeah, I've kept it ever since because, I don't know, you never know. Maybe I'll take a choreography class sometime. Maybe I'll want to shoot like a little short film. I actually have, now that you'll never see it, but but yeah, this was featured in a little short like trailer for a little indie movie I was going to be in. But anyway, yeah, great prop. I don't think I would call it a real sword though. So over here, all right. So that's the timeline so far. Now let's move on. Another little side note, just because I have it and I might as well show it. I was helping a friend clean out a storage unit, and he had he told me he had a sword, and he knew that I liked swords, and he said, help me clean out the storage unit, it's yours. So yeah, I went and helped clean out the storage unit, and this is what he gave me. And I believe somewhere, it's 440 stainless, and it's made in China. But I believe on like those museum replica sites, or you know, the Kult of Athena, if you're just looking for something to hang on your wall, I think somebody was calling this no, this isn't the Excalibur. It's got 3 lions on it, and a lion on the pommel here, and some dragons. So maybe this is meant to be Excalibur. I'm not sure. Or maybe it's like Richard the Lionheart. It's got some cool artwork on it, and so that's neat. But again, very much a wall hanger. It's stainless. It's got a little bit of flex to it. You can see the edge on this isn't really an edge. This is another one of those things meant to hang on your wall and kind of look cool and whatever. Cool gift for helping clean out a storage unit. Alright, so let's continue here. I got into sword fighting later on. And I wanted to fight with a metal sword. That was very important to me. But now that I'm looking at this thing, let me take a quick break, and I'll be back in a flash. Hang on. Sorry. All right, guys. Sorry about that. So I wanted to start fighting with swords, and I really liked the sound of metal on metal. I started fighting in a group called the SCA. Stands for Society for Creative Anachronism. You can look them up. I won't go too deep into that, but they had 2 different types of sword fighting that they were doing. One was full armored combat, which is what I do now and what I've been doing for the past 14, 15 years now. And it's amazing, and I love it, and it's the best thing in the world, and I can talk more about that later. But they also were doing rapier fighting, fencing, but it wasn't strip fencing. It wasn't Olympic fencing. It was fencing like Three Musketeers fencing. Like, you weren't confined to a strip, and it wasn't, you know... I always found back then, again, this is way 15 years ago, I found strip fencing to be incredibly boring to watch, and it wasn't something I was looking into. But they were doing fencing like I had seen in the movies, and you know, nice sweeping parries, and it was very cool and pretty easy to get into, honestly. So I bought my first fencing sword and mask and all that fun stuff, and I started doing that while at the same time I was also getting into the armored combat. It was me and a bunch of friends doing it, and it was amazing. But so this was the sword that I bought for that. Now, this has been beat to death. It used to be there was a disc right here that would protect your hand when you were fighting. This is very, very short for what most of the people in the SCA were using at the time, but I don't know, I loved it. I liked playing the inside game, and this let me get inside, and it was a lot stiffer than a lot of the swords that they were using, which was great for me and for my particular approach to fencing. I could shove a sword down and get right up in somebody's business and just boop, right on the nose. It was a lot of fun. If you're interested, I'll put a link in the description below, and you can read a lot more about that organization and what they do. But yeah, this was, again, I won't, it's closer to a real sword than anything that I've shown thus far. It has a forged tang. This one is actually threaded at the end, but it's not a separate piece. This is all one piece of metal that they then thread at the end here. It is carbon, a high carbon blade. It's been tempered. It's got good flex to it. It's a rapier, so it's different than the sword types that I've shown before. Naturally, it is very thin, and because this is used in sport fencing, there's no edge to it. It's actually got, as you can probably see there, quite a thick edge. However, it does have distal taper to the blade, which gives it a nice balance. It's probably, a bit heavier than what a sharp rapier would be of this same make and size, but it is a very effective sport tool implement. Plus, you still get that really cool, you get all that fun stuff, which makes something about that sound makes the fight sound really, really cool. So I did that for a little while, quite a while actually. I got pretty decent at it, but eventually it wasn't my sport. It wasn't quite brutal enough for me. So armored combat became the love of my life, and it has been ever since. So I might still get out there and fence sometimes, just for fun. It's great for point control and just for remaining light on your feet. The footwork for fencing is very, very different than it is for, say, fighting with a sword and a shield. But it does, there are a lot of things that cross over in all of the varying different forms. So I have a very Bruce Lee approach to studying martial arts of any kind, and that is you take what is useful, discard what is not, and keep what is you. I think I butchered that quote, but it's somewhere along those lines. So, the next sword that I actually purchased for myself was this bad boy. And I actually went so far as to make a scabbard for it. I wanted a real sword, but I was working on a budget. So, I scoured the internet and various different sites, and did just hours of research, days, weeks probably, researching swords that were in my price range, and reading reviews about particular swords and particular companies and whatnot. And that's when I found this guy. He's a little rough. He's also very old. Probably about 10 to 12 years old. And he's seen some abuse. I've done tons and tons and tons of cut tests with this guy, and it's served me well. So this is based. This is a replica sword. It is a real sword, but it is a replica. Kind of get into that here in a sec. It is based on a 15th century German hand and a half. You can find this particular design. They've embellished it a little bit, but you can find this in a museum. Oh God, should have looked that up. But yeah, it's based on a period design, and it places it somewhere in 15th century Germany. It's a hand and a half, in that you can use it one-handed, but there's enough of a hilt here that you could get two on there pretty easily and use it in a long sword or great sword type fashion. One thing you'll notice with this guy that is not something you see on these guys is, if you look at this guy, the blade stops well before we get to the crossguard, and you have this big fat piece of nothing. That's another way you can tell that it's not a real sword. Real swords typically do not have this. Unless you get into the much later periods and you start looking at some of those crazy huge great swords that had a ricasso on them, this wasn't something you would see in a sword like this. Blade goes all the way into the hilt. This particular blade is made by a company, I don't even know if they're still doing anything these days, but it was made by a company called Windlass. Windlass makes really decent sword blades for incredibly cheap prices. So this is a forged piece of steel. It has a fuller ground into it. The edge is kind of a, I won't call it a false edge, but the edge on this is okay. This is what you get for around $200, $250. This is a very nice, and it is sharp, by the way, but it's got a very nice temper to it. It's got nice flex. Point of percussion right around here. The balance is great for that point of percussion there. It handles well, and it is, for all intents and purposes, a real sword. You could use this in actual combat and feel fairly confident about it. The edges on these could be better. They could be better. It does have a soft core and a hard edge, which gives it that flex, but it maintains a decent edge. You will get nicks in this kind of thing, so this has been sharpened and resharpened more than a few times. The thing that I don't like about Windlass, in fact, one of the only things I don't like about them is the blades are great, but most of their fittings are stamped, and the fit of them is not always great. Over the years, this crossguard has become quite loose. I could fix that probably by putting some epoxy down in the crossguard there. You know, make it a little sturdier, but we'll see. I might still do that. I've actually replaced the grip on this. Before it was some fake leather type stuff, very thin over a wood core. I basically just went and hand wrapped it with some thicker leather. It actually fits my hand much, much better now that the grip is a little bit beefier. So I actually liked that quite a bit. This has been with me for a long time, and it's definitely a favorite. But yeah, she ain't pretty, but she gets the job done. Now, moving on, I have two more swords to show you, two last swords. You might recognize this from another scabbard making video. I still haven't gotten to gluing this yet. Still kind of marveling over how well this fits after the first fitting. So it's on the to-do list. This is step up from the Windlass. This is Albion Squire line. I've put a link in another video. I'll put a link again in this one. But their Squire line, Albion makes probably the best swords money can buy that aren't, say, you going to a blacksmith and having something custom made for you. These are production weapons, meaning that they make, runs of hundreds of these. But they are all designed by Peter Johnson, who is a absolutely world-renowned sword designer, sword maker. That guy he's like the Yoda of making swords. You can look him up and find just tons and tons of articles on this guy. But this is their Squire line. So this is their what I would say would be their entry-level swords. And this is the one they call it the knightly sword. Gosh, I'm saying too much. Again, you have a fully tempered blade with some decent flex in it. You have a lovely fuller running up nearly the full length of this blade. It's got a beautiful diamond cross pattern and a beautiful distal taper. This particular weapon does not have an edge to it. They sell most of their Squire line swords without an edge. They will put an edge on it for you if you want. It's perfectly serviceable as a cut test weapon. It's a beautifully made, beautiful fit and finish sword all the way through. This thing will run you around $500. But honestly, $500 is not asking much. And yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's got a basic disc pommel. You can't hardly see it here, but if you look careful at the end of the pommel there, you might be able to see some faint lines demarking basically like a little square. And that is where they have peened over the tang and then ground the edges of this pommel with a lovely satin finish that makes the tang pretty much just disappear into the pommel. It's sturdy as sturdy can be, and it's a beautiful, functional piece. And I can't really say too much more about that. I have this because I'm working on a commission. This is not my sword. I'm making a scabbard for it. I needed it for the scabbard. Alright, so, piece de resistance. This is my baby. Oh, excuse me. This is my baby. This is the Albion Templar. I saw a picture of this on their site and fell in love pretty much instantly. I love this crossguard with the just this shape. It's not a bow tie, but it flares at the ends here, and it's just so subtle and yet so incredibly beautiful. Again, we have a simple disc pommel. On this one, however, they've gone ahead and they've peened the end of the tang, and it's right there. It's a little button on the end. The fit and finish of this sword is absolutely astounding. You can see if showing you this without stabbing the sword through the camera is kind of difficult, but you can see how the blade just flows right into the crossguard there with hardly a gap anywhere around it. It's absolutely remarkable. There's a wood core that's been wire wrapped and then wrapped in leather and sewn. It's got a beautiful, that's not oxbow, that's just red. Beautiful red dye on the handle there. Red is one of my colors. And, oh my god, this is sharp. This is ridiculously sharp. Like, you can't even see, really, the edge on this thing. Beautifully balanced. This is what I would call a medieval cavalry sword. This is quite longer than what I think you would carry were you simply fighting from foot. This has the length to be swung from the back of a horse into your enemies. And it wants to. It really wants to be swung. I say swung because that's the common vernacular. We'll talk more about sword fighting in other videos. Don't try not to think swing too much when you think about striking with a sword. But this calls out to strike something. I got this when I became a knight in the SCA. If you think about it in terms of other martial arts, where you would have a black belt who would then start training and teaching others. Basically, that's the same thing. Within the SCA, once you hit a certain point in your combat prowess, you are then judged by your peers, and if deemed worthy, you are then made a knight. So it's a huge honor, huge accolade. It means the world to those that participate in the sport, and there's a big ceremony, and in part of that ceremony, typically a knight is given a sword, and I have some amazing friends who pulled their money together and made sure that I got the sword of my dreams for my knighting sword. And I did, and they did, and I'll never, ever stop thanking them for it. This is truly a magnificent piece of art and weaponry. Beautiful in its simplicity, and just evoking. You walk around holding it, and you just feel something primal. But yeah, this is my very favorite sword. They call her Voluntatum Caeli, which is Latin, or at least a rough approximation of Latin for heaven's will. And I love her. I'll be making a scabbard for this real soon. It's been way too long since I got this piece, and I've been making other people's scabbards and doing other things, so it's in the lineup. But this video has gone on incredibly long, so I'm gonna let you guys go. Thank you so much if you stuck with me through the end here. I'm gonna post a whole bunch of links in the video description if you're interested in swords and learning about them. Definitely check out the links, because I'm gonna go crazy on them. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching. Really appreciate it if you stuck all the way through. Make sure you leave a like, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. I plan on putting a lot more videos out, a lot shorter videos out, and we'll do some fun stuff real soon. I've got plans for cut tests. I've got plans for instructional videos. We're gonna have a good time. But oh yeah, share with your friends. I always forget that part. Share with your friends. Help the channel grow. Help me to keep doing this. But yeah, wow, that was a lot of talking. Thank you for sticking through. Thanks for watching. I've been Will. You be excellent to each other, and we'll see you later. Bye, guys. Bye.